Right. Yeah.
We're recording.
Hello.
Oh yeah,
Hello.
so wait, no, we're not rolling yet.
We're not
We have
rolling.
I have not said action yet.
Okay.
I just wanted to say that just so to make it very clear so there's no ambiguity and we don't talk over each other, what I'm going
Mhm.
to do from now on is I'll say my little like stupid little spiel and I'll introduce myself and then I'm going to stop talking and then you introduce yourself. I won't set you up. I won't say and I'm joined by blah blah blah, but I'll let you say what you want, okay?
All right. So after you finish introducing yourself.
Yes, exactly.
All right. Cool. This will
I'll
work
just say my
perfectly.
name. I'll say my name and then I'll stop talking and then you introduce yourself.
All right. This should be easy.
Okay. Yeah, it should be easy. Hopefully we can get this done.
Okay.
All right. Welcome everybody to another episode of your Communist Radio Hour. This is the Footnotes to Endnotes podcast. My name is Uriah Mark Todoroff.
And my name is Owen Gilbrad. Welcome to
Welcome.
Endnotes.
Welcome
Welcome.
to Endnotes.
Welcome to this post-Trump world that we live in.
Post-Trump world, yeah, he's
Topical.
the
Mm-hmm.
we have won. Biden has won, and that means that we have won.
Hero of the left, communist icon Joe
Yep,
Biden.
exactly. Ally of Antifa. He's a friend to the environment. He's a friend to the working
Mm-hmm.
man. He's going to, save the world, basically.
Yeah,
Joe
yeah.
Biden,
He's
sleepy Joe
actually
Biden.
spearheading a far leftist communist infiltration of the American government.
Yep.
Basically, he's teamed up with George Soros. So, like, I'm sure everyone listening to this podcast is very excited about the coming new world order that Joe
I thought you were
Biden
gonna
is
say.
helping.
I thought you were gonna say everybody listening to this podcast is financed by George Soros.
Yeah, I mean, like, I hope you got your check because I've
Yeah, I
certainly
mean,
been like getting my George Soros bucks
yeah,
pretty regularly.
that's Trudeau bucks. What we have called Trudeau bucks previously is Trudeau himself is Canada is as a country as a like far left cesspool is
Yeah,
basically financed
free
entirely by
healthcare.
George Soros. Yeah,
Fidel Castro's illegitimate son running the place.
yeah, yeah. That's a point in his favor. I don't know why you would bring that up. We don't like Trudeau on this podcast.
Yeah.
All right, so we're here to discuss what's it called?
I've got it written down here. No, I
The
don't.
limit point of capitalist equality. Notes Toward an Abolitionist Anti-Racism by Chris Chen, who I looked him up. He doesn't have much of an internet presence, but he's some kind of professor. I was able to figure out that much. I think he's in the humanities, unsurprisingly, and He works at an American university. So yeah, there's that. So it's pretty decent essay. It's pretty. I mean, it's very much of a pair with the essay earlier in this collection, The Logic of Gender, very much kind of working within the same framework, using the same kind of tools and dismantling another site of identity. I would say that just to like compare them, The Logic of Gender, although it was pretty significantly longer, I think around twice as long,
Yeah.
it felt like they both feel very dense, but The Logic of Gender felt less clearly written. Like this one, it felt very dense and very difficult to understand. But it felt like it had like the writer had like a better style or something. Like it was dense, but it was still clear. Like if you spent enough time with it, then you could get more out of it. Whereas The Logic of Gender, it really felt like it was crammed in there. Like it really should have been longer. So there's kind of this feeling that I had that the author, I don't know, was doing something a bit too ambitious. Like it didn't fully uh they didn't manage to fully pull it off. Whereas this one, is just some very difficult writing.
Yeah, it's like it's fairly technical, especially compared to the last two essays, which were quite narrative in form. But like, yeah, it took me a couple of reads to get through and get the ideas clearly, but I think it does articulate. I mean, as I was saying before we started recording, I feel like my immediate reaction to both of these essays was like this feeling of not having personally read enough of the appropriate literature. So I think in both cases, it sort of revealed to me like areas of ignorance on my part. But that being said, I did feel like this essay offered up like a cohesive like idea. It just took a
Right.
few tries to get it.
Yeah. It's very buried in there. Um, but yeah, to try to summarize it, basically it's like the subtitle notes towards an abolitionist anti-racism does a pretty good job of like telling you what it's about. Like the author is trying to outline an anti-racist ideology or like worldview or practice, if you will, that doesn't that uses like the same tools that Endnotes are all about. Like they're still working in the framework of value form theory, importantly, and like very strictly materialist. Um, but they're trying to like surpass the limits of like an identity based anti-racism. They're trying to like develop an anti-racist practice that is distinct from like an identitarian anti-racist practice, and overcome some of the limits, as well as like outline some of the limits of that practice, which is pretty common
Yeah.
in leftist circles. And they make the case that it's kind of like part of Marxism, it's part of its history. Do you want to give like I don't know, more detailed summary?
Yeah, I'd say that this is kind of what this article is doing is basically what you said. It's examining the idea of race, and just as an aside, they throughout this article always write race in quotation marks. They treat it kind of like a process, like something that capitalism does, racialization. And they're trying to examine like specifically what that like ascriptive process is like, and how it has endured in various forms even into the modern era, in which ostensibly and officially we live in this like post-racial liberal society where there's been all of these anti-racist movements over like the latter half of the 20th century. And what this article wants to do is it wants to like focus more on these racializing processes which are fundamental to like the capitalist system, and this like creation of like subjugated and like second class and like superfluous groups that endures to the present day, and it wants to like recognize this even in this like so-called like post-racial era that we inhabit. And it also examines like some of the limitations in Marx's own analysis in his day, and like limitations of various like Marxist movements over the last 150 years or so. So yeah, that's kind of a broad summary. I do have a quote here from the introduction, which kind of like lays out the basic idea. Overlapping with yet conceptually distinct from class, culture, caste, gender, nation, and ethnicity, race, again in quotation marks, is not only a system of ideas, but an array of ascriptive racializing procedures which structure multiple levels of social life. Despite its commitment to challenging racial ideology as the assessment of differential value to physical appearance and ancestry, much anti-racist analysis and practice continues to treat race as a noun, as a property or attribute of identities or groups, rather than as a set of ascriptive processes which impose fictive identities and subordinate racialized populations. To distinguish racial ascription from voluntary acts of cultural identification, and from a range of responses to racial rule, from flight to armed revolt, requires a shift in focus from race to racism. Focusing on the phenomenon of racism tends to narrow the train upon which race is structurally enforced to personal attitudes or racialist ideologies rather than institutional processes which may generate profound racial disparities without requiring individual racist beliefs or intentions. So that's more or less what this article is setting out to do.
Yeah, there's a lot contained in there. I think like it's worthwhile just kind of saying that like the kind of like thesis of this essay and like the practice, the anti-racist practice that they're trying to develop here, just like in the logic of gender, they wanted to abolish not only gender, which I think people will be, more or less familiar with the idea that gender is a social construct, but that essay also wanted to say that sex itself was a social construct, which is pretty radical. I mean, it was pretty radical to me. It's still have to like work through the content of that essay. Like I feel like there's a lot that I don't really understand. But yeah, in a similar way, like this essay wants to, say that race, even race, which like we so often tend to think of as like existing in like empirical biological phenomena, is like a social construct. And just like the other essay wanted to abolish gender and sex, this essay, like, they want to abolish race. And I think like just to focus on that last bit of that quote that you just read, I thought it was pretty interesting because in a way, like it kind of like they're saying that they want to focus on uh move away from looking at race to looking at racism, which like immediately you might think that like that moves the responsibility to the individual, like the, I don't know, the object of critique or whatever becomes like a racist individual. But
Mm.
it then goes on to kind of like that wouldn't be very, materialist. It wouldn't be very socialist to like shift the focus onto individuals, because like materialists understand that, you know individuals and their ideologies, their racist ideologies, are to a greater or lesser extent determined by like material social forces. So they want to, they're really emphasizing the role of um, like social processes, racist social processes. That is what this is all about. It's really about like state mandated racism. And the goal of the anti-racist practice is not to like shame individuals for being racist, but you know, I mean, there's some of that, like that comes along with an anti-racist practice. You have to confront racists,
Mm.
but yeah, like the ultimate goal is to like do away with the greater like like forces that are really determining people's ideologies. So maybe we can talk more about this idea that race is not a noun, but it is an ascriptive process. On the one hand, race is a form of cultural stigmatization and misrepresentation requiring personal, institutional, and or state recognition. On the other, race is a system of wage differentials, wealth stratification, and occupational and spatial segregation. Whether defended or derided by critics across the political spectrum, the concept of racial or cultural identity has become a kind of proxy for discussing race matters in general. Conversely, dismissals of identity politics grounded in functionalist or epiphenomenalist accounts of race propose an alternative socialist and social democratic politics of class based upon essentially the same political logic of affirming subjects, i.e., workers, within and sometimes against capitalism. This division between economic and cultural forms of race naturalizes racial economic inequality and transforms the problem of racial oppression and exploitation into either an epiphenomenon of class or the misrecognition of identity. Anyway, maybe that is not entirely relevant, but I think the idea here is like any good communist, any good materialist analysis, they want to say that not only is race the uh, results of a it's like an ascriptive process where like some social institution is inscribing race upon a given subject or class of subjects, but it's specifically the results of like racial economic processes that do the racialization. It's about wage differentials, wealth stratification, and occupational and spatial segregation. Um, this idea of occupational and spatial segregation, we've spoken a lot about in many, I mean, Endnotes has spoken a lot, and we in turn have followed them in speaking about the idea of surplus populations. Just to kind of remind you, the idea is that, capitalism in its natural functioning necessarily like sheds off labor. It requires less and less labor to do what it is that it does, create surplus value by becoming more efficient. It needs less people. So there's a segment of the population that is a surplus population. They don't fit into the economy in like a very fundamental way. The economy cannot accommodate them, and like the essay "Misery and Debt" from Volume 2 is all about this, and I think others have spoken about it as well. But yeah, so generally these people like they're left to like social welfare programs to be taken care of, and also like service economy, and this idea of like occupational and spatial segregation gets right to that. Like surplus populations are segregated into like housing projects and ghettos and like inner city kind of areas where like basically slums, and
Mm.
they're also relegated to like restricted occupations. They can be unemployed or work in the service economy basically.
Yeah, there's basically this like constant process of like othering like a particular group, like they're like relegated to like a second class position in society. um where they're like, the longer it goes on, the more and more they're seen as somehow being like fundamentally inferior. So like it's kind of revelatory how capitalism will create these like groups within society, these like groups of second class citizens who are seen as somehow being inferior because they're unable to like take part in like the middle class lifestyle or to have like some sort of upward mobility within society. And this is, I mean, especially like when you like zoom out and look at what's going on a global level, like I think they mention like, countries where there's these massive slum populations where basically nobody's employed and, the quality of life is extremely low. Like, a lot of these things just become more apparent when you like go out to like a macro level, like looking at it on like the scale of global capitalism.
Yeah, just to add on to that, they specifically reference the Mike Davis book Planet of Slums, which is, I mean, I haven't read it, but it's not even like restricted to like Brazil, for example, where the slum problem is like very extreme, and like India and like other, like what we'd associate as like the low GDP countries, to use Endnotes' terms. Like that shit exists right here in Canada and the United States. Like we don't necessarily need to go to another country to find like slums, racialized slums,
Yeah.
like food deserts, and just totally horrible living conditions. Entire like cities in the United States, like Flint, Michigan, for example, and Detroit, and like large sections of Chicago are just like food deserts. Baltimore, just like completely run down. They look like, I mean, I have been to a few American cities that just look like war torn Eastern Europe or something.
Yeah. I mean, the whole concept of like a flyover state, there's this idea that there's like a whole section of like supposedly the wealthiest country on earth and like the most abundant country on earth where it's just like a no-go zone for anyone who happens to live in like a well-off area.
Yeah. Um, hmm. Another thing that you said that I thought was interesting is this idea of like these surplus populations. There's some kind of like judgment attached to them, because like the author of this article talks at length about how the state in these processes of racialization goes to great lengths to present itself as race neutral. That is something that that's a phrase that recurs throughout this, is the idea of like race neutrality, um, like contained within these social processes of ascription. And I just I mean, what do you think about that?
Yeah,
Do you
that
have,
is
maybe you
some.
have some? Yeah, go ahead.
I think I have a quote somewhere, but that is something they lay out in this article, is that the state sort of positions itself as this like sort of non-racist, colorblind kind of like meritocracy where like everyone is equal in the eyes of the state. It's like this homogenizing agent that brings all of these like disparate groups together, like towards a sort of civic nationalism, where it's like the official party line is that everyone has like this equal opportunity to advance their like position in society, which in itself already, even if that were true, it like leads to this sort of racialization process where those who are actually not at all equal, who are in this position where they have been like disproportionately like ill affected by the system, are seen as somehow being inferior and not being able to live up to like the like the median or baseline like level of merit that's required to thrive within the society. But this idea that the state's like this neutral kind of like homogenizing agent isn't even true when you look at like the fundamentally like racist procedures that it, or racializing procedures that it takes part in, like historically, locally, and on a global level. Like something that Marx himself pointed out in his work was that if you look at like key points in the development of the capitalist system, like it required and greatly benefited from slave labor and like the exploitation of populations that were seen as being like outside of the, like this merit-based capitalist liberal society, how this sort of like exploitation of like groups that have been othered or cast off as being superfluous or not part of the capitalist system has been fundamental to the growth of capitalism since day one, pretty much. And you can see this today. I think the three examples that the article points to in terms of at least the United States is racializing practices is the US prison system, which disproportionately affects African Americans, these strict border procedures and like, you know, immigration control and like the constant like threat that's put forward of like the immigrant coming to steal labor, and finally the threat of terrorism, which, you know, is still something that it's perhaps not quite as much like a talking point now. It's still there, but like especially if we went back 10 years, 20 years, it's something that's put forward as this constant threat to freedom and democracy and liberty and everything good in the world, is like this sort of terrorist other from the Middle East, which completely ignores the sort of destructive practices that America has taken part in over there since like at least the 1950s in its own interests.
Right. So here's a quote from that. Well, we're going to talk more about everything that we were just talking about, but to move on a little bit, here's a nice quote that I think like formulates the kind of like anti-racist practice that this article is working against. So if race, in quotation marks, is thus understood in terms of difference rather than domination, then anti-racist practice will require the affirmation of stigmatized identities rather than their abolition as indices of structural subordination. Formulating an abolitionist anti-racism would require imagining the end of race as hierarchical assignment, rather than the denial of the political salience of cultural identities. Race here names a relation of subordination, the conceptual elision of the difference between racial ascription and individual and group responses to racial interpellation is endemic in much of the literature either denouncing or defending a politics of identity. From the point of view of emancipation, a social order freed from racial and gender domination would not necessarily spell the end of identity as such, but rather of ascriptive processes so deeply bound up with the historical genesis and trajectory of global capitalism that the basic categories of collective sociality would be transformed beyond recognition. I mean, I think that that last point is very true here, and really like gets to the idea of communism and like the future communist utopia. It's like so difficult to think of. Like we can think of it relatively easily in terms of like, you know, how we would organize production and like kind of set up our lives and like the kinds of things we would do. But when it comes down to like these kinds of categories of like sex and gender and race and like how they would not exist within a future communist utopia, it's for me it's very difficult to conceptualize. I don't know.
Yeah, this is, I mean, I think this is something that we've like touched upon before, is that like when you start to think of like what life would be like in some sort of like hypothetical like other system, you know, there's like this speculative frontier where you have to recognize like the limits of your own ability to like project, because like your own worldview is still like heavily colored by the system you inhabit, even if you want to like move outside of it. So it is kind of like moving towards a point in the future in space that you don't even really know what life would be like. Like I think, and this is like something to remember, because I feel like that sort of ambiguity, that like speculative nature of it, is something that like critics of any sort of social change, like not just like, you know, the proposal of like moving towards some communist system, I guess especially with like communism, a common criticism you will hear is that, it's advocating for the society in which like everyone's just sort of a faceless, interchangeable like worker drone, because you're calling for the abolition of like the current stratified like identities that we are offered. Um, Rather, I think it would be like more useful to look at like this like speculative territory as like the proposal of like, what positive directions can one move in with this? Like, how can one reconceive the idea of identity and like actually liberate themselves from like confining concepts of identity and start working towards like actively exploring the potentials of how you could sort of organize your own life as an individual or different like group dynamics.
Right. Yeah, I think this kind of gender and sex and race abolitionism kind of like gets to just how much more radical like a communist revolution will be than I feel like exists within like the popular communist discourse. I feel like it's just going to be very radical, and people don't talk about it enough, or people don't like spend enough time imagining like what it's going to be, or like how they're going to, I don't know, contribute to like these like processes of revolution beyond like doing a revolution or like organizing a workers party or whatever, and like figuring out how production is going to work or whatever. Anyway, so let's get back to this. Just going back to this quote that I just
Yeah,
read.
yeah,
If race is thus understood in terms of difference rather than domination, then anti racist practice will require the affirmation of stigmatized identities rather than their abolition as indices of structural subordination. So, just to make it very clear, um, that is like the position that this essay is arguing against in the first like clause of this sentence. They do not want race to be understood in terms of difference. They want it to be understood in terms of domination. And the idea here is that if you understand race in terms of difference, then like the anti-racist practice that we see that is dominant, that comes out of that understanding, is an affirmation of stigmatized identities. But instead, like, and that is really just it's not really revolutionary. Like, you can't really I mean, it's still like, I guess, working within the terms that are determined by, the imperialist state that has
yeah,
create like the imperial colonialist state that has like uh f- given birth to these identities back in like they historicize it back in like the 1600s with like the Spanish or Portuguese idea of pure blood. um but if you affirm these stigmatized identities, then you're not going to be able to get rid of them, which is what they really want to do. They want to get rid of these stigmatized identities, which, when you put it like that, it seems pretty obvious.
yeah, yeah. I mean, if anything, these like particular identities are like extremely easy for the capitalist system to exploit, where like, it can just endlessly create these like signifiers which are bought and sold on the market, which like you have to play into in order to like affirm whatever identity. It just becomes like a sort of another like item of flourish within like the like a badge you can wear within like the liberal society.
Right. And I think what is, again, like, this is just a great quote. There's so much contained in here, but like the last clause here, it's saying that these identities, these racialized identities that are created by all these, state mandated economic processes, are indices of structural subordination. They are not indices of some kind of like natural or essential, like biological or cultural characteristics or whatever. They are indices of structural subordination.
Yeah.
exist because like a structure has brought them into being because it needs to like create subordinate subjects.
Yeah, it's like something that's in a process of becoming rather than some sort of like, again, fundamentally eternally true like fixed state of being. Like it's not some sort of like essential like soul or like idea that like, is at the center of your being. It's rather just something that's sort of historically emerged owing to certain like processes that happened at some point, and they don't necessarily have to be eternally maintained. They're just something that are maintained for a period because of like the continuation of these processes.
Yeah, and I think like just to kind of hammer it home, um the process, one of these processes at least, is something that we've been speaking about a lot, which is the creation of surplus populations, which is, Endnotes have very effectively argued. They're not by any means the first people to argue this. It's contained in Marx that capitalism, as it develops, necessarily, structurally sheds off labor. It creates surplus populations. It creates groups of people that cannot be assimilated back into the economy. They do not have a place in the economy. Fundamentally, that's just a rule, a law of capitalism. Um, and that process has been with us for as long as capitalism, and it's tied up with racialization. It's like that subordinate population, that surplus population, has always been like because capitalism is came into being through like colonialism. It is I guess tied to like that surplus population is a racialized population, and that process of racialization is a process of like creating these surplus populations. I don't know if that makes any sense. I mean,
No, it's like I think these are the two of the major points here is that like on the one hand, capitalism and capitalist society relies heavily on racializing exploitation of various populations. And on the other hand, it also creates these populations through the phenomenon of the surplus population. I think, this is something that you can see on like a number of levels, like in the second last episode we did, which was about the United Kingdom, where like there's a point made about how like you have like the chav phenomenon, where they're ostensibly part of the same group as like the middle class citizenry of the United Kingdom, but they're already seen as like other because they've kind of been made superfluous, and they're like living in these sort of slum neighborhoods and don't really have the opportunity to like change it. But like the phenomenon is much more pronounced when it is a group that can be like more obviously like othered, like someone of a different ethnic background or of a different cultural heritage or appearance. Like it's much easier to kind of like uh internalize this sort of implicit like understanding of like the surplus population as being somehow fundamentally inferior when they are sufficiently different looking than yourself. When they look just like you, it raises too many questions about the system you inhabit and its potential to create these populations. So it's much easier when it's like a group that can be easily said to be other, and like, with the implicit suggestion that they might be inferior in some fundamental way.
yeah, I mean, I think this is a kind of good question because like there's a Marx quote in here where Marx talks about race, but he's talking about anti-Irish racism, and Irish people are white, so
Yeah.
you can be racist against white people. Like Jewish people are, sometimes considered non-white. They are sometimes considered white. It really depends on like the historical period. Like Italians as well can
East
be considered.
European.
Yeah, so they're like the all these categories are very fluid. Like the category of whiteness is very fluid and not entirely defined. So I think it is kind of like an open question whether or not we would consider a chav to be a racial group or not. Like it's and whether we would consider like hillbillies or like white trash to be a racialized group. I don't know. Well, we've covered a lot. I feel like we've basically covered these first 2 points, and
Yeah.
we've spoken a bit about the third point of the racializing patterns. Like it's something that he got into. Part where he talks about it is on the next page, so I'll
Okay.
just read it here because I'm looking at the book. So at this point, he's kind of like talking about hegemony and stuff, and he's he's done a bit of a history of like racialization. It's not much of a context, but just to get into the quote here. The changing relationship between the US state and superfluous domestic populations highlights the global foundational role of state violence as a racialization process. The role of the state itself as an ostensibly neutral agent of racial reform, rather than the principal agent of racial violence, provides the missing third term in theorizing the relationship between race and capital. Contemporary US racial politics is fundamentally structured by the decline of US global economic hegemony and by the hypermilitarization of a post racial security state in response to three racialized civilizational threats: the criminal threat of Black surplus populations, the demographic threat of Latino immigrant labor, and the unlimited national security threat posed by an elastically conceived Islamic terrorist menace whose adherents are subject to collective punishment, torture, and preemptive eradication. All three are directly targeted and racialized by the state's penal, citizenship conferring, and domestic security institutions. The rise of the anti-Black U.S. carceral state from the 1970s onward exemplifies rituals of state and civilian violence which enforce the racialization of wageless life and the racial ascription of wagelessness. Anyway, so yeah, the point here is that these three processes of, prisons, border control, and like United States international terrorism, or global security as they like to call it, like all their like imperialism and warfare carried out abroad against the Islamic subject in the name of the whole war on terror shit. It's these are like three processes of um, racialization that are ostensibly about like I guess protecting the United States or something, but really just create these three racial categories. I mean, the first being like the Black surplus population, and then you have the Latino immigrant population, and then you have like the Islamic Muslim population. Um, I don't know what else we can say about this. I guess it's interesting that the author is saying that like this is all fundamentally structured by the decline of US global economic hegemony. Well, let's try to move on to this final point here about identity politics and stuff, because we're coming up on an hour. And
Yeah.
So do you have a quote that will guide us?
The final section. Let's see what I've got
Yeah.
here. I do actually. This is from the last section, which is the trouble with class in quotation marks. Class politics as identity politics. And the author goes on to say, sweeping critiques of identity politics or of liberal multiculturalism as neoliberal mystification conceal a deeper elision of the identitarian logic at work in a socialist and social democratic politics of class. The classical workers' movement, with its concept of class consciousness, was premised upon a dream that the widespread affirmation of a working class identity would serve as the basis for workers' hegemony within nationally constituted zones of capital accumulation, and so also for a workers' revolution. Like much contemporary anti-racist scholarship, the Marxist critique of identity politics typically remakes capitalism as a problem of identity, specifically of class identity, and reduces structural exploitation to distributive inequalities in wealth. Labor and identity-based struggles assumed to be qualitatively different in such accounts are in fact structured by the same representational logic of affirming identities within capitalism. The difference that constitutes class as an identity, Ellen Meikson's Wood writes, is by definition a relationship of inequality and power in a way that sexual or cultural difference need not be. Shifting the analytic focus from difference to domination directs our attention to the entanglement of race and superfluity, as well as the racializing impact of violence, imprisonment, and warfare. Rejecting an understanding of capitalism as an increasingly inclusive engine of racial uplift and the state as an ultimate guarantor of civic equality, an abolitionist anti-racism would categorically reject the continuing affirmation of the fundamental respectability, productivity, or patriotism of racialized groups as a way to determine the relative fitness for racial domination. Beginning from radically different histories of racialization, abolitionist anti-racist struggles would aim to dismantle the machinery of race at the heart of a fantasy of formal freedom, where the limit point of capitalist equality is laid bare as the central protagonist of racial ordering. So basically what it's saying is that we need to reject all of the official state mandated anti-racist posturing that neoliberal capitalist society offers up to us and strike at the root at the systemic racializing structuring process of capitalism itself.
Yeah, that's a pretty big quote. What does it say? What is identity politics, and what is its ultimate takedown of identity politics?
All right, so
identity politics, it's it's this whole idea of affirming different identities, and that is how you be an anti-racist, is you celebrate Black identity, right?
Mm-hmm.
If race is the result of these systemic processes of racialization, then if you affirm race, then you're actually affirming those same processes that subordinate and really keep down and oppress segments of the population.
Yeah.
And at best, you can a few individuals will be able to be make something of be able to rise out of the economic subordination of the group that they are part of. Yeah. All right. I want to end this episode.
Yeah, I'm gonna have to run soon, but again, it's not necessarily our wheelhouse. Me personally, I haven't read nearly enough on this particular area, but the best I can offer up is my willingness to learn.
Yeah, I feel like we're coming out looking pretty bad in this, but
gonna have to save this one in post.
Yeah, oh my god, please. But we did our best, I guess. Yeah. I'm sorry.
I'm sorry, everyone. Please share, subscribe.
Yep. My name is Uriah Mark Todorov. You can follow me on Twitter at the inverted form.
And my name is Owen Gilbride. You can follow me around Montreal, Canada, where I live. I wear a yellow hoodie. Track me down.
Oh God. Don't say that, especially after this.
Oh boy.
All right. See you next time.
See you next time.
Bye.